Welcome back to Books with Dottie. I'm back with my part 2 of The Bewitching by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. And in this part, I'll be talking about the spoilers, the plot, a little bit more about the characters, twists, etc. So if you have not read the book and you want to avoid spoilers or anything like that, please stop here. That said, let's get into it. And so just as a quick refresh, The Bewitching is a story about really witches, witchcraft, curses, dark magic, etc. And there's really 3 different interconnected threads that we're all following in 3 different time periods. One in 1908 with a woman named Alba. One in 1934, which is about a couple of people, Beatrice and a lady named Caroline, and another lady named Virginia, who ends up going missing. And then in 1998, we follow Minerva, who is the granddaughter. I can't remember if she's the great-granddaughter of Alba or granddaughter of Alba. One of those two. I think great-granddaughter, but either way, Minerva is related to Alba. And while there is major attention paid to all 3 stories, I do think Minerva is ultimately the main character. But all these women are really dealing with evil. If you watch my spoiler-free review, I definitely enjoyed this book. It reminded me a lot of Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil. I didn't like it quite as much as that book. I thought Bury Our Bones in Midnight Soil, it just had more world building, and I wanted that gothic, dark, gritty feel. And I think Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil did that better. That said, I did enjoy The Bewitching for the most part. So one of the things that I thought was cool about this book was the little bit of Mexican culture or, Mexican flair with a specific type of witch, Tealoquani, I believe is how it's pronounced. Tealoquani. And that being a specific type of witch that almost like a vampire, really, where they like to drink your blood and then they get a taste of it and they want to eat your heart. And, they were really evil, dark witches. And ultimately, that's what our characters are up against. So I want to start in 1908 with Alba. And this, I really enjoyed, let me say this before I start. I really enjoyed each different time period. Probably enjoyed the 1934 one the most, and then probably the Alba storyline, and then Minerva. But the Alba storyline, who else could have the, evil witch possibly have been in this book? Right? It had to be Arturo. And, I said this in the review, I'm not saying every book needs to have some big, twist in order for me to like it. For instance, I recently read Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King, where, basically from the beginning of the book, you're switching between the detective and exactly who the, psycho killer is. All about his life, who he is, etc. And I love that. But this book treated the reveal that it was Arturo like it was supposed to be a reveal, right? And it just wasn't. It didn't make sense for it to be anybody else. And I think the red herring was obviously the one lady from Los Pinos that grabbed Tadeo's arm. From the big get-go, I thought that was pretty clear that she was actually trying to warn him. I guess you could have maybe thought it was Valentine, but I didn't really think that at all. This all started when Arturo came around. He was so dismissive of it. He was Mr. Perfect to Alba. And I thought that whole storyline of sexual tension between the uncle and the niece was pretty odd. Now, it was a different time frame and a different culture, so I don't know. I'm not trying to judge because I wasn't there, but just from my perspective, that sexual tension that was there between Alba and Arturo was really friggin' weird. But anyways, so yeah, it was Arturo, but even with it being Arturo, I really enjoyed that 1908 storyline, because I just think Alba was a really interesting character, because she did have this weird sexual tension with her uncle, and she had Valentine, and I think she was really falling for Valentine, and Valentine seemed like a great guy. You knew his death was coming. There was no way he was making it out of that. But Alba was just an interesting character. The twist in the 1908 part that I did not see coming was Alba getting pregnant by Arturo. Obviously you knew she had a kid at some point because, Minerva existed. But I was very surprised when her and Arturo got it on, and ultimately she was pregnant from it. So that was a surprise. Now, the 1934 storyline with Beatrice and Caroline and Virginia, which we, basically get told through Beatrice's writing as Minerva is reading through these transcripts in present day. And, you knew what was going to happen to Virginia, but man, it was just kind of like a sense of dread leading up to her disappearance. I knew how unlikely it was that she would have survived somehow, or, whatever it was, but she was from Beatrice's point of view, at least, such a cool person to be around, who, found the love of her life in Edgar and had great friends. And, she was a little bit eccentric with, talking to spirits, or, I'm going to go with how the rest of the book was and say that's real. Now, is that real in our world? I don't know. I can't say. I can't. So just seeing the 1934 play out, and that evil just get more and more dark and creepier, and it's following Virginia, and she sees footsteps, and the path changes, and all of these things are happening. And like I said, it was just kind of a sense of dread of what was ultimately leading to Virginia's disappearance, and I think what we probably all safely assume was her murder. I liked Minerva too. She grew on me as the story went on, because I think she was just broody and, I don't know, melancholy, and I understand people have mental health issues and whatever, but as kind of the story went on, it felt like she was almost taking inspiration to live from reading about Beatrice and Virginia. And her bravery just feels like she just gets more and more brave, sometimes to the point of stupidity. But, well, I'll get to the car ride in a second when she's with Caroline, but I think she just got braver and braver as the story went on, and felt like stopped feeling sorry for herself in some ways. So again, I thought this reveal was pretty obvious, and I feel like I say this way too much, but I don't think I'm like really smart or anything. It just, the only other person that I thought there was even a chance it could be was Hideo. Maybe him for some reason, I don't know. But I thought from pretty early on, when we started reading about Caroline and Virginia and Beatrice, his manuscripts, that it was going to be Caroline. I didn't think Noah was going to be involved because he just seemed too bumbling, if you will. And I mean, that's really the only characters we got to know, right? Hideo and Noah. I guess Conrad. I forgot about Conrad. It definitely wasn't going to be Conrad. He was too rude during the book. And then Caroline. And the other thing, that I thought was kind of dumb, and I guess this happened in the 1908 timeline too, but I don't know, for some reason it just felt dumber in the later timeline because Caroline had been alive so long, I feel like, compared to Arturo, was how easily that she was tricked by Minerva to, drink her poisoned blood. Feels like someone who's been alive and, this dark witch for however long, would be a little bit smarter than that. But that said, I really, the ride over was probably my favorite part of the book, when Caroline is driving Minerva to the factory. Because it's just, when somebody, I think it's just fascinating when somebody accepts their own mortality, like imminently, in order to, basically sacrifice themselves. It's just a fascinating, thing to me, because of the bravery it takes. And I think, what would I do in that situation? And I think I know what I'd do, but, can you ever really know until you're in that situation? But I thought Minerva handled it great, and, I was happy when she did survive and, took care of Caroline. But, one of the interesting parts about the ending to this book was Minerva won the battle, but not without casualty, because, for the, months later, I can't remember how long later we catch up with Minerva, she's still, having to do all these markings and these spells and whatever, and she's wondering when the next evil's going to come. That was in the back of Minerva's brain, and would be for the rest of her life, much like Alba, which, that would be draining, I think, to always be on the lookout for that. So again, she won the battle ultimately, but definitely paid, a price for that. And if she has kids, her kids are probably going to pay the price, I would assume, because, if she's involved somehow with that, she's going to tell her kids about it, like Nana did to her, or Alba did to her. So anyways, I think I've went on a while about this book. Overall, really enjoyed it. Definitely think it's worth a read. Let me know what you thought about this book in the comments. What was your favorite part? What did you think about the, reveals and ending and all of that good stuff? Let me know in the comments. If you could like and subscribe, I'd appreciate that. And I hope to see you back soon.